I'm Adrienne Klein, and I'm the Research Integrity Officer, or RIO, for the Graduate Center. You're from all fields of study, but you have some things in common. You're working as scholars. You work with mentors who will have an influence over your advancement. You will all write, and many of you will hope to publish. You'll be subject to peer review, and you will seek jobs. What we will discuss today will have relevance throughout your career. You are the future of the research in your fields. You can perform and model good research practices. This training is to remind you of ethical challenges that you may confront and to guide you to ways to manage them. I'm joined today by some of the most authoritative voices on the campuses on these subjects. I mentioned I'm the Research Integrity Officer, or RIO, for the Graduate Center, but there's a RIO on each campus. We're joined by Kristen Sommer, who's the RIO and a professor at Baruch College and at the Graduate Center. Ed Catapane is the RIO and a professor of biology at Medgar Evers College. Bill McClure, RIO, is Dean of Faculty at Queens College. Michelle Kiley, RIO, is Associate Dean for Research at the Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy, and Alan Kluger is a RIO and Professor of Psychology at Lehman College. And I'm glad that we're also joined by Paul Cran and Travis McCarthy, who are from the Central Cuny Office of Research Compliance. I'm very glad they've joined us today. And finally, we're joined by Rebecca Banchik, from whom you'll hear shortly, who at the Graduate Center is the Director of the Human Research Protection Program. My content today draws on material developed by the Office of Research Compliance at CUNY Central, and I want to thank the staff of that office, which is headed by Tamara Schneider, who's the Associate Vice Chancellor and Vice Provost for Research. And I'd also like to thank Steve Everett for his presence. You in the audience are primarily new doctoral students. Dr. Everett joined the Graduate Center just this fall as Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs. So we are welcoming him to CUNY as well as you. I appreciate his interest in this topic and his support for the work we do at the Graduate Center to prepare you to be scholars. So now we'll hear some words from Steve Everett.
Thank you, Adrienne. Welcome, everyone. And I want to thank the panelists for joining us and for this webinar. This is a critically important beginning of the discussion. This will not be the end of your awareness of these issues. As Adrienne was saying, I think what you're going through right now on a dissertation phase is really becoming the transition from a student to a scholar. And in that transition, probably ethics and the understanding of the risks of ethics is probably one of the most important things you can be doing in that transition. So today, this is going to be a great sort of dissection of the different ways that you need to be looking at that. I'm sure you'll be hearing lots about plagiarism, honesty, informed consent, data handling, privacy, confidentiality. These are all issues, how to manage the IRB process. There's so many different aspects to why ethics is a really intrinsic part of any doctoral activity. So this is not necessarily a small topic in my mind, because I think there's so many risks that doctoral students can get into unless they're constantly vigilant to make sure they're following the ideas embedded into a strong ethical basis for your research, because this is really critical for your success. So I look forward, and thanks again for Adrienne and her staff for organizing this conference and for all the panelists. And I look forward to hearing more about what the panelists have to say about all this. So welcome and congratulations on being here. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve, for your comments. I really appreciate the support of senior administration, and I think all students should be looking to you for direction. So this begins with the National Science Foundation, or NSF. The National Science Foundation tasked universities that they fund with the responsibility of training rising scholars about a decade ago. Those universities that accept their funding are mandated to train their young scholars in research ethics. So maybe you will not have NSF funding in your future. Training in the responsible conduct of research, nevertheless, is a requirement, but it's also great information. You need to know what the standards of practice are for research, publication, and collaboration. Cuny has policy online at the moment. The Cuny website is being reorganized, so I believe that these policies are not yet visible, but will be. Cuny's policy on training and responsible conduct of research, Cuny's policy for disposition of allegations of research misconduct, that is to say, if there is a disagreement and it needs to be organized as in a response, and the list of research integrity officers on campuses, all of those will be listed at the Cuny website. So what are our topics today? Research misconduct. Do people really fabricate or falsify data? Protections. Who at Cuny can answer my concerns? Conflicts of interest. This includes financial interests. Can someone make money off of your research? Mentoring. Can you ever negotiate with your mentor? Authorship credit. Who should you list as a co-author on a paper? Peer review. Who's going to be reviewing your journal submissions and deciding if they're worthy of being published? Data management. Who does your data belong to? Collaborative research. Are you working with another lab? How do you safeguard your work? And export controls. Can I share this data with everyone? What are the sources of the rules that we have to follow? There are federal regulations like that I just cited from the National Science Foundation. Also, there are those from the National Institutes of Health. There are state laws. Terms set by sponsors, that is, organizations that might fund your research. There might be institutional regulations, policies, and procedures if you work within the government, a lab, a university, or a hospital. There are requirements, for example, most grants typically have reporting requirements, which require you to report back on whether you have met the benchmarks set in your funded research. There may be standards that apply to your specific research community. Your best source on that information would be your executive officer, your EO, or your faculty advisor or another mentor, because there are standards that are specific to different disciplines. Guidelines. If you are applying for a grant, be certain to read the guidelines carefully and be fully aware of the expectations. Transparency. As in all dealings, you want full communication and transparency in all of your interactions. Cuny has requirements that you be trained in research ethics, and you're here today. So you are meeting that requirement. If you need to review some part of this afterwards, this session will be captioned and posted at my website, and I'll also put up the PowerPoint slides. Throughout the presentation, there'll be links that you won't be able to see very well on screen, but you could go to the PowerPoint slides afterwards, and you can use the links. The Cuny compliance policy for the Graduate Center makes a second requirement of those who are in the bench sciences and also those who are in psychology, social welfare, nursing, audiology, and speech and hearing. And that second requirement is that you take more in-depth training in research ethics through a training program called CITI, C-I-T-I. It's an online service that provides universities with online training programs, and that includes research integrity training, and also human subjects training, about which you'll learn shortly. So for those of you who are in the bench sciences and those other programs I mentioned, there is the second requirement. And if you're in your programs, you'll hear more about taking this city training through email. Your faculty, EO, and your APO will track when you finish the second requirement. They will keep you to that requirement. So on to our topics. Researchers and research institutions must conduct research in a way that's honest, trustworthy, reliable, and accountable. So that's the ideal state. The worst possible behavior, on the other hand, is misconduct. Behavior that falls between the two is referred to as QRP, or questionable research practices. These are bad practices. P hacking, that is reanalyzing data in different ways to yield a target result. And related to that, excluding data. Unethical authorship, unethical publication practices, and we'll go into each of these later. Non-compliance with university policies, violating privacy agreements. Non-compliance with sponsor-related requirements. Remember, your sponsor would be someone who would be funding your research. Let's take a further look at p-hacking, which again is reanalyzing data in different ways to yield a target result. If you adjust your experiment and your data enough times, you're bound to find a result that appears to be statistically significant. But that is cherry-picking data. Honest science demands that scientists go into their research with a clear, motivated hypothesis. P-hacking is unethical. To avoid p-hacking, you could pre-register your detailed research plan with an online registry. You can discuss this further with your executive officer or a mentor. In fact, I'll ask now among my panelists if anybody has any response to the idea of pre-registration. Anyone want to unmute and respond to that? I'm not hearing anything specifically from my panelists yet.
I guess the only thing that I would add is that I think this is the way that the fields are going, and a lot of journals now are requiring or very strongly recommending pre-registration as part of the process. I think that some journals have been reticent about, mandating it, but there is a trend, I think, towards asking that people pre-register their studies, or noting within an article which studies within the paper might be pre-registered. So there might be some instances in which pre-registration is problematic, but if there are no obvious barriers to doing so, it's a recommended practice.
Thank you for the reinforcement of that idea. Further bad practices are unethical peer review, misappropriation of research funds, impeding the work of a collaborator, not complying with human subjects or animal requirements, selectively citing the bibliography, and misusing your authority. And other bad practices, and this will be clear to you, is non-compliance with reporting requirements, keeping poor records, a selective transparency of your hypothesis, and conflict of interest management, and harking, which is related to p-hacking, which is establishing your hypothesis after results are known. So we can turn from that. You won't do any of those things, and let's focus on good research practices. Ideal behavior is having a sound research design and methodology, having your research be reproducible, conscientiously maintaining your data, having appropriate authorship, and for your faculty members, for them to remember to have appropriate mentorship, to use funds appropriately, disclose conflict of interest, which can often be managed, and managed conflicts of commitment, of time commitment. So ideal behavior boils down to doing the right thing. Research must be conducted with integrity by consistently doing the right thing. These slides all have at the top RCR, Responsible Conduct of Research, which is the National Science Foundation's term for specific forms of research misconduct. These categories are the ones that we RIOs respond to. They are fabrication, that is making up data or results and recording or reporting them; falsification, that is manipulating research materials. Falsification, incidentally, seriously damages research because false data potentially becomes part of the record. This might confuse subsequent researchers who cannot replicate your results. Funding might be spent on false data that's needed for research that could produce faultless data. Bad data that's made public damages the reputation of whole fields of research. And the last of these three things is plagiarism, that is appropriation of another person's ideas, processes, results, or words without giving appropriate credit. So you'll notice that I did not mention among those things human subjects research. If you use human subjects in your research, you'll need to know about the Human Research Protection Program, HRPP, at the Graduate Center. It's directed by Rebecca Banchik, from whom we're going to hear now. Some of you may not have human subjects, but it's useful to know how this is defined and what your social science colleagues must do. So Rebecca, we're going to hear from you now to introduce this topic.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. So here I have, let me share my screen. Let's see. All right, so I'm Rebecca, and yes, I am the director of the HRPP at the Graduate Center, and we'll talk a little bit about what the Institutional Review Board is about and what our program does relating to human subjects research. So Cuny basically has a shared IRB across each campus, but each campus has what's called an HRPP, so a Human Research Protection Program. And so if you do research through the Graduate Center, you will work directly with me, and I will help you get your projects approved and gone through the review system so that you can conduct your human subjects research knowing that you followed the regulations, rules, and institutional policy, as well as the federal guidelines, and making sure that you conduct research in a sound and ethical manner. So we review projects very specifically that involve human subjects, and I'll go over those definitions very briefly. And we require review by the IRB when you're conducting a research or clinical investigation involving human subjects research, and that which Cuny is specifically engaged in that research. So the term principal investigator is the lead investigator on a study, which you will likely be for your own project, unless you are acting as a co-investigator or research assistant, which means you would be working on an already existing project with somebody else who's in charge of the study as the lead investigator. We use the term PI all the time, so you'll get very familiar with that if you aren't already. And specifically, you have to be a full-time student or faculty member or adjunct faculty to actually be a PI for a study. So you can't be unaffiliated with Cuny, of course, and there are some very specific roles you may not be able to take on if you aren't a student at Cuny, but of course that's not an issue for you. If you are a student, the key thing is that you will always have to have a faculty advisor on the study with you. You cannot run your study without any oversight site. So you need to make sure you have developed a relationship with an advisor who will act as the mentor and advisor to your project. So that doesn't necessarily mean that person is the same person who will be an advisor for you in a different capacity. And so sometimes people find an advisor that really makes sense based on their research topics or research interest and expertise. So you'll create that relationship over time. We use a system called Irb Manager, and it's actually very new to us at Cuny. We just started using it a couple months ago. Once you're at the point of being able to draft and create a human subjects research protocol, if you are needing to apply, you will be doing that electronically through our system. There's a login process, there's a creating an account process, and I'm happy to go over that with anyone offline because it's a lot of more specific and not relevant quite yet for you. But just so you know, it is online and it's electronic, and everything we do is remote and electronic in terms of applications, review, and what the process of getting comments and feedback from the IRB and from the HRPP staff, that will all happen through this electronic system. I'm available for support regarding content and issues with your study design, issues with questioning what IRB regulations might apply, and anything related to the conduct of your study in terms of developing a protocol and getting it approved. Adrian spoke to the city training, the CITI training. We also require training for the IRB requirements, also through city. And so when you create your account in the CITI program, you'll affiliate yourself with Cuny, and there are various modules that need to be completed. And in that, sorry, there's ambulances. Sorry for the noise. So in that, you will have various modules that go over sort of the ethics and overview of sound conduct of human subjects research. And just like there's a requirement for you to complete the RCR training, we, from the IRB perspective, regulatorily are required to make sure that all people engaged in research, all investigators, are educated on what it is to be a part of human subjects research. So just to be clear, they're two very different trainings, but they're both in the CITI system. So very briefly, the definitions that are most important for you to take away in terms of knowing if your study qualifies for IRB review or not is to define both the word research under our regulatory definition as well as human subject. So research from our side is a systematic investigation, including research development, testing, and evaluation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. So the key here is that you are conducting a systematic study, meaning you're not just randomly collecting data or searching for a research question, that you have already established you have a hypothesis and a research question, and you are looking to systematically identify or develop some form of new information. And then the second piece of that is that your plan is to hope that whatever you discover and find out from your data analysis will somehow develop or contribute to a larger pool of knowledge, larger than a very specific program or individual. So you're not looking at quality improvement, or you're not looking at a case report of a single person, rather a larger group, or how something affects a certain class of people or a certain region. So the idea of it being generalizable is key to it being human subjects research. And then the definition of human subject is that you are obtaining data from a living individual. That's the first part of the definition. And what's important about that is if you are more of a bench scientist or someone working with historical data, and it is data of people who are no longer alive, then that by definition is not human subjects research. So you do not need to apply to the IRB if you're working with decedent data only. Our regulations say that once you've died, your data is no longer considered human, and so that's the rule that we follow. So if you are established that you are engaging with living individuals, then you will either collect data through intervention or interaction. And intervention would be like a clinical trial, some sort of treatment project. We don't have a lot of those at the Graduate Center. Most of our studies are interaction-based, and those interaction studies would be surveys, focus groups, interviews, basic tasks, an exchange of information like photographs and stories and drawings sometimes, and observation of public behavior in other types of environments. So most of our research at the Graduate Center falls into the interaction style of human subjects research. Or maybe you aren't planning to actually interact with anybody, but you do plan to obtain some form of identifiable private information. And that usually comes by way of a large data set that is existing at the time of your application. So it could be a semi-public or public data set, but with identifiers associated with the data. Or you're getting secondary data from a researcher or for some other institution that has a large research bank of information, but that is also coded and collected with identifiers associated with it. So there's different ways to get to obtain human subject data. And then lastly, and I could talk for hours, so I know I have a very short window, but this is just these are just a few things that really I think it's important to, if you are engaging in human subjects research, we have a lot of things that we consider, and our office is really responsible for hoping to prevent misconduct, because we are at the front end. You're developing your study, you're designing your application, and you're seeking approval to conduct the research. So my office really does not speak or manage working with you if there are problems. We do have a non-compliance element that we manage, but really our job is to make sure that what you propose and apply for is done with human research ethics in mind and following the regulations. So we expect a very clear outline of your study. We need a robust data security plan and how you're going to manage the data. We also need to consider various populations you might be enrolling and the fairness of that and the accessibility of that. We need to consider, for your sake and the institution's sake, what kind of timeline you're working with, what sort of resources and funding you might have, as well as what cost it might take to actually conduct your project. And then very importantly, we have a consent process that's required so that you are getting permission from individuals agreeing to participate in research. That's a huge part of what we do, is reading and editing and helping you draft consent templates so that we know that the participants who are volunteering their time have been adequately informed about research. And then there's issues of privacy in terms of recruitment and screening and making sure that people feel comfortable enrolling in research and giving us their time and potentially very sensitive information. And confidentiality, which really speaks to your plan to store data in a safe manner and a protected way, which in today's world, since most data is electronic, we need to consider if you're storing things that are shareable. Is it coded? Is it encrypted? Is it on a cloud? Is it in Dropbox? Where are you storing your data? How is it being protected? And have you thought through the various potential issues with your plan in terms of that data sharing? All right, so that is my quick spiel. And I know I actually have to jump off a little bit. I have another class in a few, but Adrian, certainly if there's questions, people can send them to me. I'll stay on for a little bit if anyone wants to throw a question into the chat. I can certainly deal with that on the side.
Well, thank you for that overview. I mean, that was a remarkable amount of information and really, really useful as an introduction. So thanks, Rebecca, for that. And thank you also for staying on for a few minutes. Those who are monitoring the Q&A might look now for some questions from students regarding human research. I'll say that a couple of students have asked whether the slides will be available. As I mentioned at the start, the slides and this video will be available at the Research and Sponsored Programs website in the next few weeks. And will there be a certificate of completion having attended this event? And the answer is yes, and you'll get that individually emailed to you if you stay with this session throughout. So now we turn from human subjects back to research misconduct. And again, these are the issues that we RIOs address. If you are accused of these or observe these in action, fabrication, falsification or plagiarism, a RIO will be asked to investigate. Research misconduct requires a finding of significant departure from accepted practices of the relevant research community. That is, if you're in the humanities or social sciences or scientific research community. And that the misconduct be committed intentionally. If a RIO does look into an allegation, they will look for the following: that the allegation be proven by a preponderance of evidence, among other things. So does misconduct happen? What are the consequences? Misconduct does not include honest error or difference of opinion. Note that. So what are the causes for misconduct? There are temptations to commit misconduct, such as publish or perish pressures. That would be if you had a position and publishing would be required for you to advance. The need to obtain research funding might push you into questionable practices or seeking promotion, or you might have reputational motivations. It's not worth it. The Office of Research Integrity, the ORI, is one of the offices that can bring to bear some penalties for misconduct. They can impose these kinds of penalties: a correction of the research record, letter of reprimand, the suspension of a grant, suspension or debarment from receiving federal funds. And beyond that, your institution can bring penalties up to and including dismissal. So you could lose a job over this. And now we're going to do a role play and see if we can get some personal idea of how this might play out in action. So in this role play, I'm going to play a professor named Professor Perfect. And my companion here is going to play a student named Stephen. So Professor Perfect says, Stephen, congratulations on that paper we published in the Journal of Biological Studies. Did you see that it's been downloaded 10,000 times from the website?
That's awesome, Professor Perfect. We are awesome. Professor Perfect, I actually just looked through my laboratory notebook again and realized that I used the wrong data set when I made figure 3 for our paper. It doesn't affect the conclusions we made, but it could waste the valuable time and resources of another researcher who may try to reproduce our work. What should we do?
Things in my lab are supposed to be perfect. Let's just forget about it and hope no one notices.
Really? We can't do that. That would be wrong. Why don't I write a new paper showing that there are different ways of interpreting the data in figure 3?
No, let's just contact the journal and issue a correction.
But Professor Perfect, how will that affect our reputation?
So that was a little bit over the top, of course, but I hope it provokes some questions. If you make an error, Can a researcher ignore that error? Can a researcher ask a journal to print a correction? And how does requesting a correction affect an author's reputation? I'd be glad to hear some responses from you in the audience if you'll type in some responses or questions in the Q&A. And I'll turn this to the panelists to see if they have any responses. Would anyone like to unmute? And Michelle Kiley.
So you can always ask a journal to print a correction. And I would think, I mean, I've never had to do this, but I would think that it would positively affect your reputation because it emphasizes that you're being honest.
Emphasizes that you're honest.
Yeah, I mean, people make mistakes, they're human. But if you saw that there was a error and you wanted to correct it, clearly that means that you realize and people are human. People are going to make mistakes, it happens, but you're at least owning up to it.
Right, how about the question of, does requesting a correction affect your reputation? You think it only is a positive thing?
I think it's I mean, unless you make, if you make errors all the time, then no, that's, it's, you know, but if it's a one-time thing, I would say it's the right thing to do no matter what, even if it poorly reflects on your reputation. But, you know, it's also, you do, the important thing is to do what's right.
I'm going to, I'll ask the panel, is anyone entering a question in the Q&A? Travis, have you noticed that?
We have one answer to the overall question in 3 parts. I believe it's Leah Coppenho says no to the first one, yes to the second. And I think it would not affect the reputation. It's actually a good thing to correct an error.
Yes, yes, I think that that's all on the mark. You can't ignore an error that you have noticed. You must ask that it be corrected for the record and for your reputation. Any other panelists have any other responses to that?
Oh, I would just say I agree with what has been said. It's better to correct than to hide information, and I don't believe it would hurt your reputation. I think it would improve your reputation by acknowledging an error was made and owning up to it.
And that was Ed Catapane, and now we'll hear from Bill McClure.
The other thing I would add is it's not just your reputation, it's also the journal's reputation. So this is not, I mean, journals are supposed to be reviewing and checking and all those processes. So it's not completely about just the authors of the paper, that there is a little bit of shared, you know, guilt or mistake or whatever it is. So people shouldn't feel that it's all on them either. And I also agree that strengthens the field generally. If your journals are admitting they make mistakes, then everyone is acknowledging that we're imperfect and things have to be corrected. And I think that that's fine. But it's not solely on you. It's not just your reputation is all that.
Yes, the journal wants to be authoritative.
Yeah.
Thank you. So how do we avoid the problems that we just outlined? Well, of our list of ideal behaviors, sound research design and methodology come to mind, and reproducibility come to mind. And appropriate authorship, but especially appropriate mentorship, because it seems like the guidance that came from the professor in this case was off the mark, and the student was bringing it to their attention, which brings to mind the possible tension in the relationship between students and mentors. Discussing things in advance is always the desirable way to practice, the desirable practice. Let's take a closer look at plagiarism. Plagiarism, by definition, is the appropriation of another person's ideas, processes, results, or words without giving appropriate credit. So how would you avoid this problem? First and foremost, by acknowledging the contributions of others. And then if you're using verbatim text that's word for word, use quotation marks and a citation, so it's clear where your source was read. Summarizing or paraphrasing, if you're doing that, you have to cite your sources. You have to cite primary sources. And when in doubt about facts or common knowledge, cite where you have read something previously. So we're going to do a role play about plagiarism. And in this role play, I'm a student named Jess, and my companion is a professor named Professor Winter. Now, Jess is writing her thesis after 6 years of study with Professor Winter, and due to excellent mentoring, Jess has published 3 first author papers that she co-wrote with the professor. So as she begins writing the literature study of her thesis, she copies and pastes some of the introductory material from the papers she wrote. Professor Winter begins to read early drafts and becomes suspicious.
Jess, your introductory material in chapter 1 of your thesis is very well written. Did you get any help?
I simply pasted some of the material from the first couple of papers I wrote.
I don't think you should do that. Isn't that self-plagiarism?
Well, I wrote it, and my thesis is simply the same work that went into the papers. What's wrong with cutting and pasting the introduction? The data is exactly the same as in the papers. So, what's the problem here? You need to cite where you have used your text before. It must be made clear that you published something before in any follow-on publication. If you don't, you've introduced redundant information, and searches may not reveal the original source. If you had a co-author, that might deny them credit on the original publication. So you cannot simply use your old writing verbatim without citing where you've used it before. You can get assistance on this problem and other aspects of your writing projects from the Graduate Center's Writing Center, who are very used to addressing this issue. Is there any response from the panel on this topic? Ed, I see your hand is raised.
Yeah, well, what you said, you have to cite it. And by citing other people's work or your own work, you only make yourself look better. It makes you look like you know the field and you can talk about it. Okay, so yeah, you have to cite it.
Right. Bill, you had something to say? I'm afraid.
I've actually had to deal with exactly this situation. It's very exciting. But the other issue in this particular case is in citing, in copying a paper which is co-authored into her dissertation, that's actually not even accurate that she's citing herself, because, or that she's copying her earlier work, because the early work is not her own work. It's because it's co-authored. So that's another twist on the whole thing. But generally, yes, you always need to cite if it's been published before, no matter who wrote it. So.
Alan?
Yeah, and if there are other co-authors and you haven't cited them, then it escalates self-plagiarism to plagiarism. So that you have to be very careful there. And I must say, in my experience of looking at research misconduct at Cuny, and I think this holds all around the country, plagiarism is by far the biggest problem among all the forms of research misconduct.
Michelle, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that there are plenty of programs available that will identify where what you have plagiarized, which is always a really useful tool, because it's often easy to slip into it without thinking about it.
Do you mean to say that faculty can discover what has been plagiarized
Oh,
by running it through
absolutely they
software?
can. Absolutely they can. But you
Yes,
can,
right.
but it's better to figure it out yourself so you don't fall in there.
Turnitin.com is one that's widely used, for instance. Yes. Okay, so thank you for those responses. Travis, I'll ask again.
Yeah, there's one question in the chat. Is it considered self-plagiarizing if you take unpublished work and rework it and trying to get it published?
Okay, Bill, you have a response there. You're muted,
I
Bill.
would say, no, it's not. If it's not been published, it's not been published. So,
If it's not been published, it's not been published. Yes.
I mean, if it's been publicly disseminated in some way, I mean, if there are a lot of informal places now where one can post things and whatnot. So you might consider that if it's important in your field. But in general, if it's not been published, it's not been published. So.
And I would say when in doubt, cite.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for those responses. Now, we're going to move on to some protections that CUNY and other universities provide. Research integrity officers don't address this topic, but it's part of ethical research practices, so I'm going to mention it today. If you use animals in your research, you must observe the rules of humane treatment. CUNY has IACUC, that's Institutional Animal Care and Use Committees on campuses where animals are used in research. So you would turn to them for guidance if you use vertebrate animals. The protections that CUNY provides are biosafety committees. Each campus has an institutional biosafety committee to ensure your health and safety and the safety of the larger community. When doing research, a conflict of interest can exist for several reasons, but primarily for two. First, financial, that is when there is the possibility of financial benefit to the results of your research, which can bias you towards a certain result. Or there could be a conflict of interest of commitment. You want to keep your communications with colleagues clear and use your resources fairly and honor your time commitments. On each campus, there's a conflict of interest officer with whom you can confer if you have any questions. Then there's the issue of mentor and trainee responsibilities. You are guided through your academic work by mentors, an academic advisor, an executive officer of your program, and they mean a lot to you. Make sure that you understand from the start what's expected of you. After the fact, it can be harder to get these issues sorted out, so address them as soon as you see an issue. You'll want to set expectations proactively, clarify the way you'll be evaluated, be clear on what your responsibilities in research will be informed about any standard operating procedures. You want to establish from the start who will have authorship and ownership of data or writing. And you want to be certain to be aware and compliant with institutional requirements. So now we're going to do another role play, and this one's about competing interests. And in this one, I play a professor, Professor Brown, and my companion will be Stephen, a student. Stephen, a grad student, is looking forward to starting his thesis work in the lab of a well-known professor. That's me, Professor Brown. The research project he'll be working on is supported partly by the university, but mainly by a company of which Professor Brown is a co-owner called Huge Enterprise. So I'm Professor Brown, and I say, Stephen, this is not a big deal, but I want you to know that I'm part owner of a company named Huge Enterprise, and Huge Enterprise is funding the research on which you will be basing your thesis.
Oh, I thought the university was supporting the study. Should I be concerned about your relationship with Huge Enterprise?
No, not at all. As I mentioned, it's no big deal, really. But you should also know that my company and I will probably make money off of the research we're doing. Oh, look, it's time for lunch.
Does this mean anything for my thesis?
No, the fact that I'm part owner of Huge Enterprise and the company that's funding this study will have no effect on your ability to carry out the objectives of your thesis. Don't worry about that at all. My priority is making sure that you graduate with your doctoral degree on time. Several months pass. Hi, Stephen. I know it's late, and I know that I asked you to stay late to work on these experiments last week, but things are really moving ahead with the research.
Okay, Professor Brown, I'd also like to spend time at some point working on my thesis when we're done with these experiments, if that's all right.
Of course, no problem at all. But we're getting ready to license out our research findings. So I'm sure you understand that working on this is priority. So, are there any concerns about Professor Brown's role as company owner and also principal investigator and also faculty advisor? Does Stephen have any rights to anything that may be commercialized from the research findings? And who can Steve talk to? How should Stephen handle this conflict with Professor Brown? I'll give the audience a moment to respond, but I'm wondering if the panel has any responses to this. I'll start by saying that I mentioned before that every campus has a conflict of interest officer, and that would be the person that Stephen would want to go to. There is no problem. There should be no problem and no hesitation on the part of a student for going and seeking conversation with someone in the building who is there to help them, like a conflict of interest officer. At first, they'll discuss with you what the situation is as you see it, and they will talk to the faculty member. And there can be a meeting of minds. These things can be managed often. So don't be afraid that you're in the role that will put you in conflict with your faculty member who means so much to the progress of your work toward your degree. Now, does someone else have anything to add on the questions of, for instance, does Stephen have rights to anything that might be commercialized from which there might be a profit made?
Hi, I said, can you hear me?
Ed,
Okay,
please, yes.
yeah. Okay, well, the way you presented it, I think there are problems, conflicts of interest. I think that I'm hoping that the mentor has a conflict, has an agreement with the college, the university about the funding and the profits. Maybe they don't, but certainly the student up front should have been included. They're doing the research. Are they going to benefit from the financial gain of this? There should have been some agreement ahead of time with the mentor and with the university. So it looks like a bad situation if none of those things were done. And it looks to me like the mentor is prolonging the graduation, the awarding of the degree with the student by having the student work on this project so that the company can make money and prolonging it rather than trying to help the student complete their project and earn their PhD.
Yes, there are several problems with this, and certainly strongly I agree with the fact that If the faculty member is in any way impeding the student's work toward their degree, then that is unethical. And bear in mind, again, as I was saying, that there always are two stories here. So it would be interesting to have heard from the faculty member in any of these cases, what their perspective was on this, how possibly they could justify what appears to us in these kind of over-the-top role plays, justify some behavior. Are there any comments from the audience on this, Travis?
Just agreeing that there does seem to be a conflict with the professor. And I can chime in for a little bit since I'm the conflict administrator for Cuny. There's a misconception that it's when someone hears conflict of interest, they say, oh, I shouldn't have any. It is common that our faculty has conflict of interest. Cuny is not going to discourage PIs and other faculty from having these positions in companies or other nonprofits. The point is that you disclose it properly and that the conflicts committee sets up a management plan with the campus so that all of this can be properly documented. But it's not wrong to have a conflict. It just needs to be managed.
Yes. Thank you for that note. Most conflicts can be managed. Alan Kluger has something to chime in with?
Yeah, just one step further down the line, if this work comes to publication, any authors with conflict should report that to the journal, and there's usually an entry of that somewhere in a footnote in the paper.
Thank you. Yes, that's right. Thank you for that. And again, to Travis's point, conflict of interests exist and can be managed in most cases, and you want to have that handled before the work begins, early in the process. So moving on. Again, discuss things in advance and establish ground rules. And of our list of ideal behaviors, the ones that are called to mind in that role play are appropriate mentorship, appropriate use of funds, disclosing conflict of interest, and managing your conflicts of commitment. All of those things were in peril in that little role play, but they can be worked through. Okay, responsible authorship. Who should be listed as an author on a paper? It should be someone who made a significant contribution to the research, someone who assumed responsibility for data collection and analysis, someone who participated in drafting the publication and approved the final publication. Improper practice is honorary authorship and duplicate publications. Honorary authorship would be if you respected somebody who was an author or had contributed to your academic work, but they had not done any of the things that are used in the bullet points above. They are not to be mentioned as an author on a paper, though you can put in a note honoring them. And peer review. The responsibility is that you assess a project for quality and you make a judgment regarding the importance of the research. That's the role of the person doing peer review. Doing it responsibly is that you do it in a timely fashion. Any feedback you give is constructive and free from personal bias, and you maintain confidentiality. The most respected type of publication is in journals that require a review of papers before publication by others in the field, that is, those who are known to be peers or equals in their knowledge of the field. Perhaps not yet, but you're probably going to be involved during your professional life in peer review on one side or the other of the table. Now we have a role play on authorship. In this one, I'm a grad student, Jess, and I'm approaching my mentor for some credit for some writing that she did. So the mentor begins.
How are you today?
Not so good. The anxiety from this issue has been keeping me awake. It's distracting me from my work too.
Well, that sounds pretty serious. What exactly is the nature of the problem?
I really don't know if there's anything that can be done about it. I'm working with Professor Green. He asked me to write a chapter for a book, but now that it's finished, I think that he removed my name as an author.
Authorship questions can be tough to deal with sometimes. Are you sure that you should be listed as an author on this chapter? Did you talk about authorship when you started the project? Explain your version of the situation to me.
I thought that you might have questions, so I brought drafts of everything I worked on, including the note that Professor Green gave me to start working on the chapter. See, he commented on each draft, and I did all this work.
Well, it looks like you did a lot. How do you know that you are not an author on the chapter? Did Professor Green tell you?
My friend saw a final draft of the chapter in the department office, and my name was not on it. I talked to Professor Green, and he was dismissive, saying it was just a good learning experience for me. So we know how we might avoid that problem through appropriate authorship and appropriate mentorship. But what questions does it raise? I mean, you need Professor Green for your future career, and you're upset and a little unsure of what to do. You think you deserve credit, and you're looking for good advice. How can you convince the mentor that you did, in fact, write a significant amount of the chapter? Now, a good thing that the student did in seeking assistance was to pull together all the documentation. And you might further, if you're going to have a meeting, write up questions in advance that you might ask, and think of questions that you might be asked to prepare yourself best. What do you think is the perspective of Professor Green? That's not addressed in this role play, but what would you think of the person who, through their reputation, perhaps had the opportunity to publish and pulled you into the project and ultimately didn't list you as an author? So now I'm turning to the panel if there is any response to that, or to you in the audience.
Paul has his hand up. Paul, why don't you go
Oh,
ahead?
yes, Paul?
Hi, just I'd like to point out that in this situation, it's a chapter of a book. So it's much, so corrective action after the fact is going to be extremely complicated and it may very well be impossible because you can't really print a correction to a book. And also books may or may not be peer reviewed as opposed to journal articles. So, and I think you're right to raise the point. First of all, discuss in advance. I'm happy to work on this, but I'd like to make sure that I have an authorship credit, and that's the point you decide whether or not you want to do the work, and I think you pointed out a very real world situation by saying that you're going to rely on Professor Green, for letters of recommendation, for all kinds of stuff later on. So at this point, this is just a terrible thing that Professor Green did, and it really should have been the case. And it puts the onus on the student in this situation to decide how big a deal that they want to make out of it, I'm not, they may or may not decide it's worth escalating, but they might want to consider changing advisors if that's possible.
Bill, do you want to add something?
I was just going to say these situations, I mean, as Paul just said, are very, very complicated, and it's, I mean, it's almost impossible to give a one. It's not like a one size fits all answer. So if a student found themselves in this situation, I think they should certainly talk to their RIO or someone like that. I mean, it's possible for a RIO to talk to a publisher. I mean, we involve everyone in the process if this sort of thing happens, because it can have, I mean, it can and should have an impact. If it's real, it can and should have an impact on the faculty member's reputation and sort of the way, you know, journals and publishers view their work. But the issue of when is it appropriate to escalate or how far? I mean, I've had faculty who have actually taken this on, but they didn't do it until they got their first job. Like, so I have faculty, you know, they're brand new faculty, but they've always felt this was the case. And so they're sort of looking, so they bring it up to me after they've started working at Queens College, and then there's still issues with their advisor and things like that. And it's very messy. And the reality is it almost never works also. I mean, I've never, you know, but the timing thing is very tricky because it can be, your advisor has so much control over. So Paul's advice also to get another advisor, that's also smart. If you feel this is going on, then you should try to find someone else to work with. And then decide as you move on in your career, how much you want to hold on to it. But it's always worth raising. And a RIO will keep all this confidential, and we'll do things in an appropriate way so no one would know anything. And can sort of give neutral advice so the student can understand all the options and implications of those options.
Thank you. Kristen, you have something to add. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just like to follow up on what Bill was saying and maybe even take a slightly stronger position on this. I think it's fine to say that, you know, students, proteges should be discussing with their co-authors and particularly advisors, you know, what the authorship would be on collaborative work. But I think that any reasonable person who's being asked to draft a chapter would go into that arrangement with the expectation of authorship. I don't think it, you know, we need to be careful not to say, oh, well, you should have talked to them in the first place, and now you're in this situation, it's kind of your own fault. And nobody's saying that, but I want to make it clear to those who are listening that this is a case of plagiarism and that it absolutely should go to the RIO. And if, you know, in this particular scenario, you know, you've got documented evidence that you have intellectual property that is being taken, whether it's by your advisor or somebody else, it would be the RIO's responsibility to launch an inquiry in that case. And at that point, it may not really matter what the student does and does not want to do. This becomes an institutional problem. This becomes an issue with a member of the faculty who's engaging in potentially engaging in research misconduct. So I would say that while it's absolutely the protege's decision as to whether or not to pursue this, and that the concerns over potential retaliation are real, and the potential political, you know, fallout is real, that they should understand that they would have the backing of the institution of the RIO to protect them and to help them pursue this if in fact it, you know, rises to the level of research misconduct. And I think in this particular scenario it does. So I would be, you know, if I, as the RIO, if somebody came to me with this, I would be moving forward with an inquiry, and I would certainly try to do everything I can to make sure that that student is then placed into a different lab where they could reach their milestones and continue to do work without having to suffer any long-term career implications associated with coming forward.
I appreciated that all of your remarks, and the scenario is perhaps over the top, but of course, egregious things like this do occur. But faculty are not typically your adversaries; there's your advocates typically. But In this case, I think the student did the right thing by collecting some documentation. I mean, that's what's mentioned at the end of the presentation. That would be important to be able to show communication through emails, say, with the faculty member, so as to have clarified if there was a lack of clarity or whether or not there was an exchange of thought about what credit the student would get. I think that Ed wanted to add some last remark and then we'll move on. Ed?
Yeah, I'll be quick. I do agree with everything that was said. I want to make a point of for the grad students when they're deciding like who they want to try to work with as their PhD mentor for their research. They do need to get opinions from other students and from graduates who've gone through this about the integrity and professionalism of the potential mentors. Have they heard of this type of behavior from a potential mentor? I've seen it. I've heard of cases. So I caution the students to be careful in selecting your mentor because you're going to be with that person for a while and it's very important, and you don't want to select a mentor who has a reputation for plagiarism and stealing students' work.
Thank you. That was a very good addition. Paul, do you have an additional point to make? Or am I mistaken? Is your hand no longer raised?
Oh,
It's fine.
okay, thank you.
Okay,
There
thank you.
are two questions in the chat about
please.
this.
Yes.
One person wants to know what are the best practices for new students and employees at the beginning of their careers to have these discussions without appearing presumptuous or insubordinate.
Insubordinate. Interesting. And what was the other question, if we can handle them both?
Sure. What is the best resource at Cuny for advice regarding intellectual property questions, such as ownership of source code, data sets, or the ability to share those? Which for that second part of the question, if the Rio is unable to answer questions like that, something like sharing data is something that happens here at Cuny, but that's where we get the lawyers involved. You need a special agreement in order to share data between institutions.
Yes, actually, I'm going to address that very soon in this presentation, how you establish a memorandum of understanding on those shared projects. As for the first question, Travis, you want to take a stab at that?
For new students and employees, I mean, this whole thing is surrounding the Rios. The Rios are definitely the best resource for making sure that your work is compliant and protected. And it's like what Paul, Michelle, all the other panelists are saying is that if you have a bad suspicion about an advisor, it's okay to seek another one or the assistance of maybe the department chair or something to kind of mediate between the two.
Yes, at the Graduate Center, we refer to them as executive officers, the chairs of the departments, and that would be a person that you would turn to if you wanted to change whose lab you were working under. I thank you all for your contributions on that. I think we're going to move along, but I'm glad if that provoked questions in your minds. Again, I don't think faculty are adversaries. For the most part, they are certainly not. But it's good to have raised this in your minds. I hope that you'll be aware and proactive if you should find yourself asked to do some joint research. Data management comes up next. Who owns your data? It could be your university, or if you have a contract for funding, it could be your sponsor. Science students at the GC are funded, so their lab notebooks belong to their labs. This you should discuss further with your executive officer. CUNY has an intellectual property policy. It is linked to from within this slide. And again, you'll see the link if you look for the slides once they're posted at my website. Data sources and data collection. data must be recorded such that it can be validated and there is appropriate authorization. And you must properly store it to avoid accidental damage. You must honor privacy agreements. And you must retain the data according to whatever your contract or the institution dictates. Cuny again has a computer resources policy, which Travis was just beginning to refer to, and it's online. And data sharing. We can enter into various types of data sharing agreements, which brings us to collaborative research. If you're doing research with someone in another lab, perhaps in another institution, you need to define each of the collaborators' roles in a written agreement. That's the wisest way to protect yourself from accusations after the fact that you didn't hold up your end of the bargain. And it's the way to get your collaborators to fulfill their part of the project. Ensure that there's a common understanding of the research goals. If you're working across universities, be familiar with each institution's intellectual property and ownership policies so you aren't taken by surprise after the fact. Now, we mentioned before management plans for conflict of interest. If you're managing a plan financially, and there's training and supervision or compliance, all of these things are going to be mentioned in a management plan, which can be arranged at the start to declare what kind of conflict you might have and how you're going to work through them. As Travis mentioned, the term conflict of interest sounds like it's something that should be incorrect, but in fact, it happens because we all have multiple interests in our lives, and some of them perhaps are in counterpoint, but this all can be managed. Now, as was mentioned, if you want to enter into a formal agreement, or you should enter into formal agreements before commencing collaborative research, examples of the kind of documents you'll sign will be memoranda of understanding or a memorandum of agreement, so an MOU or an MOA, a material transfer agreement if it requires you to literally physically acquire transfer of materials, or data transfer agreements. You can't just sign these without having first checked with the institution, your university, because there is a set of signatory authorities which can sign off on obligations for people from within Cuny. So you have to check, there's a link here to the site. So if you're pursuing research with another institution, there is a certain level of authority who has to sign off in agreement to that. Now we get to our last topic, which is export control. There are materials or processes that are inherently for use by the military, but there are also dual use materials and processes that may be useful in civilian, but also Department of Defense settings. An example of that might be cryptography, which might be pursued by a mathematician, or material science research in our labs. Then there's the issue of who's doing the work. Do you have collaborators in countries where the US has sanctions? Those are Cuba, Iran, Syria, or Sudan. Or are you a non-US citizen working in a lab on research that is subject to export control? Each campus has an export control administrator, and you can confer with that person. I'm the export control administrator at the Graduate Center. And know that the US government does restrict access to some research by non-US citizens. So you'll want to turn to your faculty and the export control administrator if this is an issue for you to get guidance. Now, as is the case with conflicts of interest, work that is export controlled is often fine as long as prior authorization or a license is acquired. So once again, there's not an adversarial situation there, just a statement of the situation before the fact. Any responses from the panel or the audience on this? Paul or Travis? Okay.
Well, I will say that that the exceptions for fundamental research govern the vast majority of activities at virtually everywhere, even at places that are very technologically oriented, like Caltech or MIT. So it's going to be real specific. So it's, but usually what will happen is the award agreement or the contract will specifically mention something about it, and then you'll know to go to your export control person. You don't need to know every single thing that might be export controlled. You just need to keep an eye out for certain terms, and that's going to be the responsibility really of the PI of the grant, and less so of the student. But if you're here on an HB1 visa, or if you're here on a student visa, and the work going on in the lab is export controlled, even though we can get a license, to have you participate, it could be prohibited, it could be expensive. So there may be projects that just you aren't going to be able to work on, and that's the real downside, I think, for students and export controlled works, is that they don't necessarily have, the full range of research experiences available to them as a green card holder or a US citizen would have.
Someone take a stab at a definition of fundamental research, so we'll know what the distinction is.
Well, a fundamental research is basically that there's an intent to publish and disseminate. So if there's a non-disclosure agreement or some other activity, some other governing document or reason why the results of the research or the research processes can't be published or disseminated, then that's fundamental research.
Yes, and that is the most of the work that's done at the CUNY campuses.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. Thank you for that. Travis, are there any questions that you see online?
No one's asked any questions.
Okay. We'll move along. Incidentally, while we're not going to view this now, I recommend this short video as a review of what we've just discussed. Again, the link isn't going to be viewable in the PowerPoint slides, but the video of the session will be at my website. And this is a review of the topics we've covered: research misconduct, protections, conflict of interest, mentoring, authorship credit, peer review, data management, collaborative research and export controls. And these are the people that we've cited who you can turn to for guidance: your professor, another mentor on the faculty, your executive officer, that is the chair of your department, the conflict of interest administrator on your campus, the export control administrator, the HRPP director. If your plagiarism issue is one that's attached to academic work, then you turn to your academic affairs office. There's an ombudsman at the Graduate Center named Martin Gitterman, who is an ear for any moment when you might want to discuss relationships between faculty and students and the like. He is available to, in a non-threatening environment, to discuss things. And then I'm your research integrity officer for the Graduate Center. And this is the list of the ideal behaviors that we discussed. So again, ideal behavior requires that you're ethical, you use sound judgment, you promote trust, you conduct your research with integrity, and you do the right thing. I want to thank those of you who have participated today, all of you in the audience, and also you'll see at the top some sources for the information that I used. And that concludes the webinar. And I hope we'll hear from you in the future. Those of you who are in the sciences will now be turning to do your CITI training in RCR. And the rest of you can turn to us on the campuses for questions. But we hope that you never have any problems with ethical behavior in your research. I'm sure that you will not, you who are the future of the research in your fields. So thanks for your attention today, and goodbye.